Big house. Colonel Buckminster had one of the largest farms around Framingham. He needed many slaves and servants to help run the farm and to take care of his other affairs. He was an important man in the community. His house was the largest building on the farm. It was a two-story frame building, painted white and surrounded by a lawn as smooth as a green carpet. Here and there on the lawn were trees and bushes, and at the front and sides of the house there were borders of flowers. In summer, a large tree shaded the porch at the front of the house. There were other buildings, back of the colonel's house, barns, stables, sheds, and cabins for the slaves and servants. The cabins were small, but each had a garden and a shed and pen for a cow and a few pigs. The servants were white persons, known as indentured servants. They had agreed to work for the colonel for a certain number of years because he had paid their way to Massachusetts. At the end of their agreement, they would be free and could do as they wished. The slaves, on the other hand, were mostly Negroes. They belonged to the colonel for life and never would be free. Either the colonel had bought them, or, like Chris and Phoebe, they were children of his slaves. The colonel owed much of his success and happiness to his slaves and indentured servants. For this reason, he treated them kindly and tried to help them live well. Prince and his wife and many others liked the colonel and appreciated his kindness. They believed they should be contented and not worry about the future. There were others, however, who were unhappy and wanted to be free. For some reason, young as he was, Chris was interested in this group. One morning when Chris was 10 years old, he and his father sat in front of the cottage, resting and talking. The sun was shining. There was a fresh breeze and the odor of growing plants filled the air. Prince had a few things that he wanted to say to Chris. "You were behind the big house last night," he said. "Yes, father, I was there, but I didn't stay," said Chris. "What goes on back of the big house that makes you want to go there?" asked Prince, eagerly awaiting his son's response. "The people there have fun, father," said Chris. "They laugh and sing and dance and tell stories. They have popcorn, too." "Why are you excited about popcorn?" Prince exclaimed. "We've had popcorn here at home ever since you were able to remember. After all, the Indians had popcorn first." "I know, father, but you don't understand." "You're a big boy now, Chris," Prince said seriously. "You're 10 years old and it's time for you to settle down. You must choose the kind of work that you want to do here and then learn to do the work well. Most boys of your age already know what they want to do. You must stop this nonsense." Chris said nothing for a while. He wiggled his toes as he often did when he was troubled. Finally he said, "Father, I won't always be here. Someday I'm going to be free, and when I'm free I'll work on a boat." Prince sighed. "You're old enough to think for yourself and not let others talk you into things. Our life isn't bad, is it?" "No," Chris admitted. "We hardly know that we're slaves here," Prince went on. "We have our own cottage, our own piece of land, and our own animals. We have plenty of food to eat and good clothing to wear. We keep on living this way as long as we wish. Why should we want anything else?" Chris hung his head. At last he looked up and said, "The trouble is that we're even different from the other slaves, father. Who wants to be different?" "Is that what the slaves behind the big house tell you, son? Is that how they've convinced you that something is wrong with your life? Is that the reason you want to be free?" Chris nodded. "Look around you, son," Prince went on. "The colonel gives me responsibility to run the farm here and rewards me by allowing me to live better. People with responsibility always live better than others. That's the way it was in Africa, and that's the way it is here. I can't understand why you should worry about being different as long as you have an opportunity to live well. Sometimes in this life it's good to be different." He paused to watch Chris, but there was no expression on Chris's face. Then he added, "Don't let others make you unhappy, son. You're young and have your whole life before you." Suddenly Chris lifted his head. "Slaves can be punished," he said. "They can even be whipped if they don't obey orders." "All people can be punished if they don't do right," said Mrs. Attucks, just returning from the big house. "God takes care of people who believe in him and people who do right. If we do right, we don't need to worry about being punished. Our master, Colonel Buckminster, is very kind to us. He's not the kind to punish people, and no one else will bother us." "I'm just mixed up," said Chris. "But somehow I seem to want to be free rather than be a slave. I know that here with Colonel Buckminster we live almost as if we were free." "I must get back to work," said his mother. "But let me remind you of one important thing. You must think for yourself and not let others influence you. Some of the other slaves may not be happy, but it won't help to stir up trouble. You can't afford to be mixed up with them. Just do what is right and you'll be happy." Games and songs. For a time Chris tried to obey his parents and stay away from the cabins behind the big house. Before long, however, he began to slip away and to spend more and more time there. He liked to mingle with the slaves. The slaves' cabins were smaller than the Attucks' cottage and not so well furnished. Each cabin had a fireplace for heating and cooking and a small collection of pots and pans. Each contained a bed, a table, and a few chairs and stools, and each was neat and clean. Each yard was covered with grass, shrubbery, and flowers. Behind each cabin there was a garden and a shed and pen for animals. The slaves who worked in the colonel's house lived in somewhat better cabins than the slaves who worked on the farm. The difference in the cabins often caused hard feelings among some of the slaves. Strangely enough, even though Prince ran the farm and his wife ran the big house, no one seemed to envy them. Prince always tried to treat the slaves squarely, and they believed in him. He frequently made trips through the slaves' quarters just to talk with them. He was never too busy to spend time with them, even though he wanted Chris to stay away from them. One morning, Chris was 12 years old. He asked Phoebe to accompany him to the cabins. They went behind the kitchen of the big house with its huge fireplace, where their mother was baking bread, biscuits, and cookies. They stopped at the smithy to watch Jonah, the smith, repair a broken wheel. Jonah liked his work and was contented with his food, shelter, and clothing. He refused to join other slaves in complaining and talking about freedom. Like Prince and his wife, he was happy to belong to the colonel. He believed deeply in God and liked to pray. "I like Jonah," Phoebe said, as she and Chris moved on from the blacksmith shop to the row of cabins where the slaves lived. "I like him too," Chris said. "But I don't understand him. I don't understand father and mother either. They don't seem to care because they belong to somebody." "Chris!" Phoebe was shocked. "Well, they don't, but I can't help but care." Chris walked along, kicking the dirt at the path with one shoe. "I don't like the idea of belonging to someone, not even to the colonel. Father said I should think for myself, and I've been thinking. I just don't like the idea of being a slave all my life." Next, Chris and Phoebe passed the stable and the coach house. They stopped to talk with the coachman and was cleaning the colonel's fine coach. In a little while, the two children returned home, but that evening after supper, Chris went back to the cabins. Now that he was 12 years old, he was allowed more freedom than he had when he was younger. He liked to talk with different slaves and learn about the day's happenings. Most of all, however, he liked to take part in the storytelling, dancing, singing, and playing games. This evening he joined a group of slaves who were visiting Aunt Maria. "Chris," she said, "why don't you lead us in 'Did you feed my cow?'" "Yes, good," everyone cried. Chris rose and stepped into the center of the circle. He looked at the faces around him. "Did you feed my cow?" he called. "Yes, sir," the others answered. "Will you tell me how?" he asked. "Yes, sir," they chorused gleefully. "What did you give her?" "Corn and hay." They began to sway rhythmically. "We just gave her corn and hay." They began to clap their hands. Aunt Maria suddenly stepped into the circle beside Chris to lead the Juba dance. She stamped her foot and patted her hands twice, and the others followed suit. The dance was continued for several minutes. When the dance stopped, Chris called excitedly, "Did you milk her good?" "Yes, sir," the others answered. "Did you do it like you should?" "Yes, sir." "How did you milk her?" Swish, swish, swish. They moved their hands as if they were milking a cow. "We just milked her. Swish, swish, swish." Now Aunt Maria began her Juba dance again. Stamp, pat, pat, stamp, pat, pat, stamp, pat, pat, stamp, pat, pat. The rhythm grew stronger and louder as the group picked up. Stamp, pat, pat, stamp, pat, pat, stamp, pat, pat. Suddenly, a weird whistling sound outside the cabin interrupted the dance. Aunt Maria stopped leading the dance, and all the noise and clapping died down. "What was that weird whistle?" the people asked one another. "That was my father," said Chris. "He wants me to come home. Good night." He disappeared quickly into the darkness. Prince was waiting for Chris outside the cabin. "What was all that noise?" he asked. "We were playing 'Did you feed my cow?' But we hadn't finished. I had 2 more rhymes to call out when you whistled." "Your mother was worried about your staying so late," Prince said as they walked toward the cottage. "She wanted me to come after you." "She shouldn't worry," said Chris. "I'm 12 years old and 5 feet and 5 inches tall." "Yes, you're 12 years old, but you're still our son. We worry about you when you stay away from home in the evenings." "I'm sorry, Father," said Chris. "The next time I go behind the big house, I'll tell you. I just have to go there. The older I become, the more I want to go there." "Then you won't stop going there?" Prince looked a little surprised. "No, Father, I can't," said Chris. "Those are my people. I belong there." Prince looked sad. "Be careful then, Chris. Don't let them get you into trouble." "I'll be careful, Father."